Hey everybody, I want to set up the lecture for Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. So I'm going to try and go as fast as I can. Hopefully my recording isn't glitching like it did last time. One of the things I think, I'm going to give you a list of ideas and I want you to write them down. So this would be like a real action. I'm looking at the screen, a real lecture. So anyway, I want you to think about these things when it comes to um, the sun also rises and modernism. One of the things I think the thing we want to start with is, or that I want to start with is Freytag's pyramid. And you guys know it as the dramatic curve, or you may have heard it as the dramatic curve. And you can see if you see my cursor, every novel or every piece of writing starts with, I shouldn't say most every piece of writing starts with this exposition, which is kind of like setting the stage for who's where are we, what's the setting, what time period in history, who are the basic players. And then we have some sort of incident that usually happens. Okay, like if we were to follow, say, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we would, I've used this before with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and students often are not sure whether the inciting incident was it when Victor created the monster? Was it when the monster was let loose on its own? Was it when the monster started killing? Or was it when everybody was dead and Victor started looking for the creature? So wherever it is, there's always going to be a climax in a traditional story, in a traditional novel. It will look like this. We find out who the characters are. Oh, Mary Shelley creates Dr. Frankenstein's family, right? So we learn all about Victor Frankenstein's, wholesome family. We kind of have what's at stake there. And then we have the idea of Victor Frankenstein as the tragic figure. He has this idea that somehow he was born at this time to, do this amazing creation. And so he has this egomaniacal sense of his place in the whole story. And Mary Shelley positions him that way. So the rising action is all the complications. Something happens and there's more conflict, until it's teetering on the edge. Something has to go somewhere because human beings cannot sustain a heightened climax for very long. So whether it's psychologically or otherwise. So something has to happen, it happens, and then we start to feel the pressure releasing, or we start to know that the story is kind of winding down and resolving. So another way to look at that is I like to look at it more like this instead of the reversal. This could be if it was a tragedy, let's say a Greek tragedy, the falling action, the resolution. And I love that this particular diagram includes the denouement, which I hope I'm saying that right, but it sure sounds good in French. It really means the tying up of loose ends. When we're sitting in a movie theater watching the movie, the denouement is when we already know kind of how the movie's really ending, but it really hasn't wholly ended yet. But we're already in the denouement, talking to each other about how much we liked it or didn't like it, or should we go get coffee? Should we go get pizza? So during the denouement is when the audience gets to kind of come back to sort of their own reality and their own time. Right? The reason I'm bringing all this up is because in the modern era, during modernism, the dramatic curve is not capable of holding the action together. It's not even really a factor. So if you think about The Sun Also Rises, there are several actions that take place, and I don't know where the climax is. So you might think of it differently, and when you read it, but I think theorists agree that during the modern era, the traditional dramatic curve kind of melts under the pressure of modernism. So I wanted to start there. And then I want to talk about some of the characteristics of Hemingway's writing so that you can make better sense of how his writing maybe differs from some of the other authors. For example, Hemingway is known as a kinetic author, okay? He's kinetic, and if you know what kinetic means, it's about movement. Modernist fiction, not unlike a lot of fiction, generally has some kind of quest. In this era, in the modern era, they're preparing to kind of recompose themselves. They want to live all they can. They're trying to eke out meaning in a disordered and confused world. They're seduced by really temporary and transitory pleasures. They seem to be a generation with not much ambition or motivation or the feeling of consequences about their action. Hemingway says this quote, "Never confuse movement with action." It's pretty interesting because there is a lot of movement in The Sun Also Rises, but how does it differ from action? Okay, that's another thing we want to talk about is the iceberg effect. Let me see if I can, I hope I kept that on here. I'm not sure if I did or not. We'll come to it. Let's talk about the use of dialogue. Dialogue is a way most writers didn't concentrate on dialogue. They were like on plot and character. Hemingway is known for his use of dialogue, and some theorists think that as contemporary readers that we're used to thinking that dialogue is conversation, but in Hemingway's writing, it's not conversation because that would imply reality is involved rather than artificiality. So let's try and remember that dialogue itself is a construct, just like, say, race or gender, or in the modern era, time is a construct. Dialogue is a construct. It's artificial. It's much more believable than real conversation. And just as fiction distorts its own reality in order to maybe achieve a larger truth, so dialogue eliminates all the false starts and irrelevant intrusions into real life order. And dialogue reveals character, and dialogue moves the encounters. So it's not action necessarily that's moving, it's dialogue that's moving the characters. This is ironic, I think, because when we look at language is inadequate, or the inadequacy of language in the modern era, the theorists look at it as like language had just broken down so badly that it was dehydrated, like the externals, the way we talk, the way we communicate had somehow been dehydrated and distilled to the use of gesture and minimalist physical details. So if we think about gesture, it reminds me of the metaphor article or the chapter that we read in Geary's metaphor book. The gesture, remember, we can do a thumbs up gesture. Well, there's a lot. If you were just to read Hemingway's novel just for gestures that are used in the novel, it'd be amazing. A waiter can, like, swipe a table with a cloth, or somebody can do something else, and they're gestures, but they move the narrative. It's really interesting. Hemingway also does things besides using gestures and, just his move away from connecting dialogue to reality. He also uses a couple of, I'm going to call them literary devices. He uses something called paratactic, which means longer connected sentences or thoughts that are punctuated by short ones. Okay, so it has a rhythm, but it's anti-metronomic. Okay, that's another idea. It's anti-metronomic. So writing dialogue, that is what Hemingway does, but it goes against the conventional back and forth rhythm. If you look at his dialogue, it feels kind of stilted and non-standard, even though it's grammatically correct English. It's just not. It's spoken in a tap 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 zing, the way a typewriter would sound. Think of them typing all that was their technology of the day. So in a way, his use of economy of language and his use of dialogue is mimicking the sound of the typewriter. Tap, 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 zing, tap, 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 click, zing. I don't know if I'm doing it right. If I had a real typewriter here, I probably could. Some of the other things that you want to think about with Hemingway is his use of silence. He uses dialogue, but he also uses silence. And if it was turned into film, we'd probably see long stretches of silence. And you want to ask yourself, does stuff still happen during silence? Is silence real? Is it just an absence of words? What is it? He, besides his use of silence and dialogue, he uses light. How much does he use light or darkness in his story? And what do those symbolize? We also could think about some recurring structural designs, like his kinetic use of outside, inside, outside, or to where, toward, there, and away. So there's these kinetic designs where the characters are moving in these particular directions, inside, outside, and then back inside again. So think about the kinetics involved, not just the narrative. Also, now let's talk about the narrative framework. Who is the narrator? Is it Hemingway? Is it Jake? Is it some omniscient narrator that, what did they call that back in grade school? The fly on the wall narrator who seems to know everybody's truth. Some people think the narrator is Jake. And then, of course, we get back into the same thing we would talk about with Nick in The Great Gatsby. Are they reliable narrators? And you think about it, they're fictional characters themselves. So we tend to be the ones who trust what they're saying. Obviously, time as a construct, time is really complicated in The Sun Also Rises. I don't know about you, but my feeling is almost like, hey, don't you guys have something to do? You sure do waste a lot of time. But time was measured differently for them. And let's not kid ourselves. They don't have the normal things that sort of chop up a day and call it reality that the contemporary world has now. We also can see perhaps that the the lost generation, was embracing meaninglessness as their form of meaning. They live what seems like a meaningless, inconsequential life, but it has meaning to them. Alienation. Oh my gosh, these people are so alienated from one another. They are really superficial and seem to only be able to connect on that superficial level. What else do I want to say? Again, we could come back to the didactic purpose. Does Hemingway have a purpose in mind? One of his own quotes, he says, is, read anything I write for the pleasure of reading it. Whatever else you find will be the measure of what you brought to the reading. So that's Hemingway's own quote. Read anything I write for the pleasure of reading it. Whatever else you find will be the measure of what you brought to the reading. I think that really sums up no didactic purpose. Okay. Let's see. What else do I want? Speaking of, let's go here. Let's talk now about the Lost Generation. You guys have already, you have links on in our course to look at, but I think that it's worth sort of bringing ourselves back to that it was mainly young people who were impacted, who served in the military, right? So those casualties were not scattered across the demographic. It made a huge dent in the world's young people, the numbers of them. And so people who did survive, if you were lucky enough to survive, you were usually PTSD. Maybe people felt alone. Maybe they came back disabled. They felt alienated and pessimistic about the future, and who wouldn't? So I don't want us to feel sorry I don't want to do a bunch of pathos here, but I think we should keep the Lost Generation's mental state in the center of our mind when we try and dissect the artifacts of that time period. The Lost Generation, I don't think we can come close to experiencing that sense of collective emptiness and loss that they felt. Although I don't know, I don't in any way want to make a false analogy and compare what has happened globally with COVID to a world war, but there certainly are some similarities. Many pictures of people who were not able to tend to their dying loved ones with COVID. Their lives were changed. So I think you could do that on your own. Here's Hemingway. He was injured. Remember, he did fight in the war. He didn't necessarily fight. I think his job, he was an ambulance driver on the front lines, and you see a lot of brutality. So he not only received some medals for his service, he was also wounded. Whether he was wounded like Jake was, I don't know that we have the anecdotal evidence to support whatever wound that Jake supposedly suffers from. Okay, another picture of Hemingway. I think it's easy to see these old pictures of like Hemingway's The Old Man in the Sea, or Hemingway at his bars, that he owned in Key West, Florida. We forget he was a young guy